Most people who read philosophy end up more confused about life, not less. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You can memorize every quote from Marcus Aurelius and still feel completely lost when your boss criticizes you or your relationship falls apart. Philosophy books gather dust, while real problems demand real solutions. The issue isn't that philosophy is useless. It's that we treat it like intellectual decoration instead of practical tools. We read about Stoic principles, but never actually practice emotional regulation. We admire Buddhist wisdom, but skip the daily meditation that makes it work. A recent study found that people who actively apply philosophical principles report 40% higher life satisfaction than those who only read about them passively. I'm going to show you exactly how to transform abstract philosophical concepts into concrete daily practices that actually change your behavior. We'll cover the three-step system I developed after studying applied philosophy for over a decade, working with hundreds of people who successfully integrated these teachings into their real lives. By the end of this video, you'll have a clear framework for turning any philosophical insight into a practical habit that improves your relationships, career, and inner peace starting today. Part 1. The Philosophy Testing Ground Method. Here's something that will shock you about every philosophical text you've ever read. The ancient Stoics didn't develop their principles while sitting in comfortable libraries, sipping wine and contemplating abstract concepts. Marcus Aurelius wrote his most profound insights while commanding armies on brutal battlefields. Epictetus formulated his teachings on resilience while surviving as a slave. Yet somehow, we've convinced ourselves that we can master these same principles while lounging on our couches. You know that feeling when you read something incredibly wise, feel inspired for exactly 30 seconds, then watch yourself completely fall apart the moment someone cuts you off in traffic or sends you a passive-aggressive email. That's not a character flaw. That's what happens when you try to learn swimming by reading about water instead of jumping in the pool. Your brain doesn't care about philosophical wisdom until it needs philosophical wisdom. Neuroscientists have discovered something remarkable about how we actually form lasting behavioral changes. The neural pathways that control your automatic responses only get rewired when you're emotionally activated. When your heart is racing, your palms are sweating, and you're feeling that familiar surge of anger or anxiety, that's when your brain is actually plastic enough to install new programming. Think about it this way. A soldier doesn't learn to stay calm under fire by reading about courage in peacetime. They develop that unshakable composure through repeated exposure to controlled stress during training. Your daily life is full of these same training opportunities, but you've been treating them as interruptions instead of laboratories. This first technique out of 6 would transform how you interact with every stressful moment in your life. Instead of avoiding discomfort, you're going to start seeking it out strategically. You're going to create what I call philosophy testing grounds, controlled environments where you can practice wisdom under pressure. Here's how this works in practice. Let's say you've been reading about the Stoic concept of emotional regulation. The idea that you can choose your response to any situation, regardless of external circumstances. Sounds beautiful in theory. But theory doesn't help when your boss publicly criticizes your work, or your partner brings up that sensitive topic again. The testing ground method means you deliberately put yourself in situations where your emotional regulation will be challenged. You call that difficult family member you've been avoiding. You have that overdue conversation with your roommate about rent. You speak up in the meeting when you normally stay silent. Each of these becomes a laboratory where you can experiment with applying Stoic principles in real time. But here's the crucial part. You're not throwing yourself into the deep end. You're creating graduated challenges, like a video game that slowly increases the difficulty level. Maybe you start by practicing emotional regulation during a mildly frustrating phone call with customer service. Then you work up to addressing a conflict with a colleague. Eventually, you're ready for those big, life-changing conversations that used to paralyze you. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it reveals which philosophical principles actually work and which ones are just pretty ideas. When you're in the middle of a heated argument and you successfully apply the Stoic technique of pausing before reacting, you don't just understand that principle intellectually anymore. You feel its power in your bones. You experience the immediate relief of not being hijacked by your emotions. That visceral understanding creates motivation that no amount of reading can match. I've watched people transform completely using this method. Sarah, a marketing manager I worked with, used to describe herself as someone with a short fuse. She'd read dozens of books on emotional intelligence, but still found herself snapping at her team during stressful projects. We started small. She practiced patience during her daily commute, consciously breathing through moments when traffic slowed down. Then she moved to more challenging scenarios, like staying calm when clients changed requirements at the last minute. Within 3 months, her team was commenting on how much more composed and effective she'd become as a leader. The testing ground method works because it aligns with how your brain actually learns. Every time you successfully apply a philosophical principle under stress, you're literally rewiring your neural pathways. You're proving to yourself that wisdom isn't just for philosophers. It's for real people dealing with real challenges. Most people treat philosophy like a museum exhibit, something beautiful to admire from a distance. But the masters who created these teachings were using them as survival tools. They developed these insights specifically to handle the messy, uncomfortable, unpredictable nature of human existence. When you start practicing philosophy the same way they did, under pressure and with real stakes involved, you finally understand why these teachings have survived for thousands of years. The next technique we'll explore takes this practical approach even further by showing you how to decode the real-world problems that every philosophical system was designed to solve. Part 2. The reverse engineering approach. Most people study philosophy backwards, and that's why they never make it work in their actual lives. They start with abstract concepts like virtue or suffering, and try to figure out what these ideas mean for someone living in the 21st century. But here's what they're missing. Every philosophical system was created by a real person facing specific, concrete problems that would sound remarkably familiar to you today. Buddha wasn't contemplating the nature of suffering as an intellectual exercise. He was a prince who had never experienced hardship, then suddenly encountered old age, sickness, and death for the first time. The shock of realizing that no amount of wealth or privilege could protect him from these realities drove him to develop a complete system for finding peace despite life's inevitable difficulties. When you understand that Buddhism emerged from someone grappling with existential anxiety and the fear of mortality, suddenly concepts like impermanence and non-attachment become practical tools instead of mystical abstractions. Marcus Aurelius wasn't writing his Meditations as a philosophy textbook. He was an overwhelmed emperor trying to stay sane while managing a crumbling empire, dealing with political betrayals and watching plague devastate his people. His Stoic principles weren't academic theories. They were emergency protocols for maintaining mental stability when everything around him was falling apart. This second technique out of 6 will revolutionize how you understand and apply philosophical wisdom. Instead of starting with the teachings, you're going to start with the teacher's life. You're going to reverse engineer their philosophy by understanding exactly what problems they were trying to solve. Then, mapping those problems onto your own experience. Here's why this approach is so powerful. Context creates meaning. When you understand that Nietzsche developed his ideas about creating your own values while dealing with chronic illness, social isolation, and professional rejection, his philosophy stops being about abstract concepts and starts being about resilience in the face of adversity.
When you realize that Confucius was essentially trying to rebuild social order in a time of political chaos and moral breakdown, his teachings about relationships and ethics become incredibly relevant to navigating modern workplace dynamics and family conflicts. Let me show you how this works with a concrete example. Take Viktor Frankl's concept of finding meaning in suffering. Most people encounter this idea and think it sounds nice but impractical. How exactly do you find meaning when you're going through a divorce or dealing with a chronic illness? But when you learn that Frankl developed these ideas while surviving Nazi concentration camps, watching his family members die, and fighting to maintain his sanity in the most horrific circumstances imaginable, the practical application becomes crystal clear. Frankl wasn't philosophizing about meaning. He was creating a mental survival strategy. He realized that he couldn't control what happened to him, but he could control how he interpreted what happened to him. He could choose to see his suffering as meaningless torture, or he could choose to see it as an opportunity to prove that human dignity is indestructible. That choice between interpretations literally kept him alive. Now, when you apply this same framework to your own challenges, you're not trying to implement some abstract philosophical concept. You're using a proven survival tool that worked under the most extreme conditions possible. The reverse engineering approach also reveals why different philosophical systems work better for different types of problems. Stoicism emerged from people dealing with external circumstances beyond their control: war, political upheaval, natural disasters. That's why Stoic principles are incredibly effective for handling modern stressors like job insecurity, health scares, or relationship conflicts. Buddhism developed in response to internal suffering, the mental anguish that comes from craving, attachment, and the gap between expectations and reality. That's why Buddhist techniques are so powerful for dealing with anxiety, depression, and addiction. Once you understand the original problem a philosophy was designed to solve, you can identify which aspects of your life would benefit from that particular approach. Are you struggling with control issues? Stoicism offers time-tested strategies for focusing on what you can influence while letting go of what you can't. Are you caught in cycles of wanting things you don't have and being dissatisfied with what you do have? Buddhist principles about contentment and non-attachment provide practical solutions that have worked for millions of people. I worked with a client named David who was struggling with imposter syndrome in his new management role. He'd read dozens of self-help books about confidence, but nothing seemed to stick.
Then we explored the background of William James, the father of American psychology, who battled severe depression and self-doubt throughout his career. James developed his philosophy of pragmatism, specifically as a response to his own feelings of inadequacy and uncertainty. He created the concept of choosing beliefs based on their practical consequences, rather than their absolute truth, essentially giving himself permission to act confident even when he didn't feel confident inside. When David understood that James had invented pragmatism as a personal solution to imposter syndrome, he could apply it directly to his own situation. Instead of trying to convince himself he was qualified for his role, he focused on choosing thoughts and behaviors that would make him more effective as a leader, regardless of how he felt internally. The transformation was remarkable, because he was using a tool that had been specifically designed for his exact problem. This approach also helps you avoid the trap of trying to adopt entire philosophical systems wholesale. You don't need to become a full-time Stoic or Buddhist. You can cherry-pick the specific tools that address your specific challenges, just like the original philosophers were doing when they developed these ideas. The third technique builds on this foundation by bringing other people into your philosophical practice, creating accountability that makes abstract wisdom impossible to ignore. Part 3. The Philosophy Accountability Partner System. Here's the uncomfortable truth about why most philosophical insights never translate into actual behavior change. You can lie to yourself about whether you're really living according to your values, but you can't lie to someone else who's paying attention. Your internal narrator is incredibly skilled at justifying why that angry outburst was totally reasonable, why that ethical shortcut was necessary, or why you'll start practicing patience tomorrow instead of today. But external observation cuts through all that self-deception like a laser. Think about the last time you completely lost your temper, acted petty, or made a decision you knew contradicted your stated values. In the moment, you probably had a dozen reasons why your behavior was justified. Maybe you were tired, stressed, or the other person deserved it. Your brain is designed to protect your self-image by creating these explanations. But if someone you trusted had been watching, they would have seen the gap between who you claim to be and how you actually behaved. This third technique, out of 6, harnesses the power of social accountability to bridge that gap. You're going to find someone who can serve as your philosophical mirror, someone who will lovingly but firmly point out when your actions don't align with your stated principles. This isn't about judgment or criticism. It's about creating external awareness of internal inconsistencies that you literally cannot see yourself. The research behind this approach is fascinating. Social cognitive theory shows that behavioral change accelerates dramatically when others monitor our consistency between beliefs and actions. It's the same reason people lose more weight with a workout partner, stick to budgets better when they're shared with a spouse, or follow through on goals more consistently when they've made public commitments. Your brain takes promises to other people more seriously than promises to yourself. But here's what makes the philosophy accountability partner system different from other forms of accountability. You're not just tracking whether you meditated today or whether you lost your temper. You're examining the deeper patterns of how you respond to life's challenges. You're looking at whether you're actually embodying the wisdom traditions you claim to value. Let me give you a specific example of how this works. James had been studying Stoic philosophy for 3 years. He could quote Marcus Aurelius, understood the dichotomy of control, and genuinely believed in Stoic principles. But his wife Sarah started noticing something interesting. Every time James encountered traffic, a work setback, or even a minor inconvenience like a slow internet connection, he would react with frustration and complaints, the exact opposite of Stoic emotional regulation. When Sarah pointed this out, James's first instinct was to defend himself. The traffic really was unreasonable. His work situation was genuinely stressful. These weren't philosophical tests. They were legitimate problems. But Sarah kept gently highlighting the pattern. She wasn't attacking him or trying to make him feel bad. She was simply reflecting back what she observed, a gap between his philosophical ideals and his daily responses. That external perspective created awareness James couldn't achieve on his own. Once he started noticing the pattern through Sarah's eyes, he began catching himself in the moment. He started recognizing the early warning signs of his non-Stoic reactions and had the opportunity to make different choices. Within a few months, both James and Sarah noticed a significant shift in how he handled everyday stresses. The key to making this system work is choosing the right partner and establishing the right framework. Your accountability partner needs to be someone you trust completely, someone who has your best interests at heart, and someone who isn't afraid to tell you uncomfortable truths. They also need to understand that their role isn't to fix you or judge you. It's simply to observe and reflect. You'll want to establish clear boundaries about how this feedback gets delivered. Some people prefer daily check-ins, others want weekly conversations, and some just want their partner to speak up in the moment when they notice inconsistencies. The format matters less than the consistency and the spirit of loving honesty. What's particularly powerful about this approach is how it makes philosophy visible in your relationships. When your partner understands your philosophical commitments, they can support your growth in ways that wouldn't be possible otherwise. They might recognize when you're facing a situation that calls for Stoic patience, Buddhist compassion, or existentialist authenticity. They become allies in your practice, rather than obstacles or distractions. I've seen this system work with married couples, close friends, family members, and even professional colleagues. Maria and her sister Carmen developed a pact around Maria's commitment to Buddhist principles of non-judgment. Carmen would gently point out when Maria was gossiping about co-workers or making assumptions about other people's motivations. At first, Maria felt defensive, but she quickly realized that Carmen was helping her see blind spots that were preventing her from living according to her values. The accountability partner system also creates what psychologists call implementation intentions, specific if-then scenarios that help you respond differently to triggers. When your partner points out patterns in your behavior, you start developing automatic responses. If I feel myself getting frustrated with slow service, then I'll take 3 deep breaths and practice patience. If I catch myself judging someone's choices, then I'll remind myself that I don't have complete information about their situation. What makes this technique so effective is that it transforms philosophy from a private, internal practice into a shared, observable commitment. You can't fake your way through it or convince yourself you're doing better than you actually are. Your growth becomes visible not just to you, but to someone you care about. That external accountability creates motivation that internal willpower alone can't sustain. The fourth technique takes this practical approach even further by showing you how to embed philosophical practice into the smallest decisions you make every single day. Part 4. The Daily Micro-Dilemma. Practice. Your character isn't formed by the big, dramatic moments you think about when you imagine testing your values. It's shaped by thousands of tiny decisions you make without even realizing they're decisions at all. How quickly you respond to that text message. Whether you take the parking spot someone else was clearly waiting for. What you choose to eat when you're stressed. These micro moments are where your real philosophy lives, and most people completely ignore them. Here's what's fascinating about human behavior. Your brain doesn't distinguish between small choices and large ones when it comes to building neural pathways. Every time you practice patience in a minor situation, you're strengthening the same mental muscles you'll need when facing major challenges. Every time you choose honesty in a low-stakes conversation, you're reinforcing the neural networks that support integrity under pressure. But here's the problem. Most people save their philosophical practice for big moments and wonder why they can't access wisdom when they really need it. This fourth technique out of 6 will revolutionize how you think about character development. Instead of waiting for life-changing situations to practice your values, you're going to transform every mundane decision into a philosophy training ground. You're going to use your daily routine as a laboratory for developing the habits of thought and action that define who you really are. The science behind this approach is remarkable. Habit formation research shows that practicing principles in low-stakes situations builds the neural pathways needed for high-stakes moments. It's like developing muscle memory, but for wisdom. When you repeatedly choose patience while waiting in line at the grocery store, you're literally rewiring your brain to default to patience when facing bigger frustrations. The neural patterns you establish in small moments become automatic responses in crucial ones. Let me show you how this works with concrete examples. Take the simple act of responding to text messages or emails. Most people react immediately based on their mood, energy level, or whatever emotion the message triggered. But what if you turned each response into an opportunity to practice a specific philosophical principle? If you're working on Stoic emotional regulation, you might pause before responding to any message that triggers irritation, asking yourself, is my response coming from wisdom or from immediate emotional reaction? If you're exploring Buddhist compassion, you might consider the mental state of the person who sent the message and choose words that acknowledge their humanity rather than just addressing their request. If you're practicing existentialist authenticity, you might ensure your response reflects your genuine thoughts rather than what you think the other person wants to hear. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it removes the pressure of trying to be philosophical in high-stress situations. You're building your wisdom muscles during routine interactions when the stakes are low and your mind is calm. By the time you face a real crisis, a work conflict, a relationship challenge, or a personal setback, responding from your philosophical center feels natural instead of forced. Sarah, a software engineer I worked with, decided to use her daily commute as philosophy practice. Instead of seeing traffic jams and subway delays as annoyances, she reframed them as opportunities to practice stoic acceptance of things beyond her control. Every time she felt frustration rising, she would remind herself that anger about transportation delays was literally choosing to suffer twice, once from the inconvenience itself, and again from her emotional resistance to it. This might sound trivial, but the results were profound. After 6 months of practicing acceptance during her commute, Sarah found that she stayed calm during much more significant setbacks. When a major project got cancelled at work, when her landlord suddenly raised her rent, when her relationship went through a rough patch, she had developed the mental habit of asking, "What can I actually control here?" instead of immediately spiraling into frustration and anxiety. The key is to identify specific decision points that occur regularly in your life and consciously assign philosophical frameworks to them. Maybe you practice gratitude every time you eat, considering the chain of people and circumstances that brought food to your table. Maybe you practice humility every time you're tempted to interrupt someone, catching yourself and choosing to listen more deeply instead. Maybe you practice courage every time you have the opportunity to express an unpopular opinion, or stand up for someone who isn't present to defend themselves. The micro-dilemma practice also reveals how often you make choices that contradict your stated values. You might discover that you're less patient than you thought, less generous than you believed, or less honest than you assumed. This isn't cause for self-criticism. It's valuable data about where your practice needs to focus. What's particularly powerful about this technique is how it democratizes philosophical growth. You don't need to retreat to a monastery or wait for life-changing events to develop wisdom. Every interaction with a cashier, every decision about what to watch on Netflix, every choice about how to spend 15 free minutes becomes an opportunity to embody your highest values. Marcus, a teacher I worked with, used his classroom management as philosophy practice. Instead of reacting automatically to disruptive students, he would pause and consider what response would best serve both the individual student and the class as a whole. This practice of pausing between stimulus and response, a core Stoic technique, gradually transformed how he handled conflict in all areas of his life. His colleagues started asking him for advice about staying calm under pressure, not knowing that his composure came from thousands of tiny moments of choosing wisdom over reactivity. The daily micro-dilemma practice creates what psychologists call implementation consistency, the alignment between your professed values and your actual behavior. Most people experience significant gaps between who they think they are and how they actually respond to daily challenges. This technique closes that gap by making every small choice an opportunity to practice being the person you want to become. What makes this approach so sustainable is that it doesn't require additional time or energy. You're going to make these small decisions anyway. You're just going to make them more consciously, using them as opportunities to strengthen the philosophical muscles you'll need when facing bigger challenges. The fifth technique builds on this foundation by showing you how to learn from the inevitable moments when your practice breaks down and you act contrary to your values. Part 5. The Philosophy Failure Analysis. Here's something no philosophy book will tell you. You're going to fail at living your values regularly, and that failure is actually the most valuable part of your practice. The moments when you lose your temper despite studying Stoicism, when you act selfishly despite reading about compassion, when you lie despite valuing honesty, these aren't signs that philosophy doesn't work. They're gold mines of information about what conditions cause your wisdom to break down and how you can redesign your life to make philosophical behavior automatic instead of effortful. Most people treat their ethical failures as evidence of weak character and try to move on as quickly as possible. They feel guilty, promise to do better next time, and completely miss the opportunity to understand why their practice collapsed when they needed it most. But what if you approached your philosophical failures with the same systematic analysis that aircraft investigators use when studying plane crashes? This fifth technique out of 6 will transform how you relate to your own imperfections. Instead of seeing failures as character flaws to be ashamed of, you're going to see them as data points that reveal exactly what environmental and psychological conditions need to be modified for your values to hold up under pressure. The aviation industry has the safest transportation record in human history, precisely because they treat every failure as a learning opportunity. When a plane crashes, investigators don't just blame the pilot or declare flying dangerous. They conduct exhaustive analyses of every factor that contributed to the accident. Weather conditions, mechanical issues, communication breakdowns, training gaps, protocol failures. Then they systematically address each contributing factor to prevent similar accidents in the future. Your philosophical failures follow similar patterns. They don't happen randomly or because you're fundamentally flawed. They occur when specific combinations of circumstances overwhelm your capacity to respond from wisdom instead of reactivity. When you understand those patterns, you can modify your environment, your preparation, or your response systems to prevent similar breakdowns. Let me walk you through how this works with a real example. David struggled with anger management despite years of studying Buddhist teachings on compassion and patience. He genuinely wanted to respond to frustration with equanimity, but he kept losing his temper during certain types of interactions. Instead of just feeling guilty and promising to try harder, we conducted a systematic analysis of his last 5 angry outbursts. The pattern became immediately clear. David's failures happened consistently when 3 factors were present simultaneously. He was hungry, he was running late, and someone was speaking to him in what he perceived as a condescending tone. Any 2 of these factors he could handle with his philosophical practice intact, but all 3 together created a perfect storm that overwhelmed his capacity for patience. Once David understood this pattern, he could design specific interventions. He started carrying healthy snacks to prevent hunger-induced irritability. He built extra time into his schedule to reduce the stress of running late. And he developed a specific protocol for when he detected a condescending tone. He would take 3 deep breaths and remind himself that the other person's communication style reflected their own stress or training, not their assessment of his worth. The philosophy failure analysis works because it moves beyond willpower and addresses the systemic factors that influence your behavior. It's based on the principle that you are not a disembodied mind trying to impose values on a reluctant body. You're an integrated system that responds predictably to specific inputs. This approach also reveals why generic advice about trying harder or being more mindful often fails. Your philosophical breakdowns aren't caused by lack of effort or awareness. They're caused by specific identifiable conditions that can be systematically addressed once you know what to look for. Elena used this technique to address her struggle with gossiping, which contradicted her commitment to speaking kindly about others. Through failure analysis, she discovered that she was most likely to say negative things about people when she was feeling insecure about her own performance at work and when she was in groups of 3 or more colleagues during lunch breaks. Understanding this pattern allowed her to develop specific strategies. She started keeping a small notebook where she wrote down 3 things she'd done well each morning to address the insecurity trigger. And she began eating lunch one-on-one with colleagues, instead of in larger groups where gossip was more likely to emerge. The key to effective failure analysis is conducting it without self-judgment. You're not trying to prove you're a bad person or confirm your worst fears about your character. You're gathering objective data about what conditions support your best self and what conditions make it difficult to access your values. This requires the same dispassionate curiosity that a scientist brings to studying any other natural phenomenon. Here's the framework I recommend for conducting your own philosophical failure analyses. First, document the specifics of what happened without editorial commentary. What exactly did you do or say that contradicted your values? Second, identify the circumstances present at the time. Were you tired, stressed, hungry, or dealing with other challenges? What was the social context? What had happened earlier that day that might have influenced your emotional state? Third, look for patterns across multiple failures. Do your patience breakdowns happen more often in the morning or evening? Are you more likely to act dishonestly when you're behind on deadlines? Do you struggle with compassion more in certain relationships or situations? Fourth, design specific interventions based on the patterns you identify. These might involve changing your environment, developing new preparation routines, or creating protocol responses for high-risk situations. What makes this approach so powerful is that it transforms failure from a source of shame into a source of wisdom. Every time you act contrary to your values, you're gathering information that can make future philosophical practice more effective. You're essentially conducting ongoing research on the conditions that support your best self and the conditions that make accessing wisdom difficult. The philosophy failure analysis also helps you develop self-compassion, which is crucial for sustainable growth. When you understand that your failures follow predictable patterns based on identifiable circumstances, you can address them systematically, instead of concluding that you're somehow fundamentally flawed. The sixth and final technique will show you how to bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern life by translating timeless insights into contemporary practices that fit your actual lifestyle and constraints. Part 6. The Ancient Modern Translation Method. Ancient philosophers were solving the same fundamental human problems you face today, but they were working with the tools and language of their time. When Marcus Aurelius wrote about accepting fate, he was developing a practical strategy for handling situations beyond his control, the same skill you need when dealing with traffic jams, difficult colleagues, or global pandemics. When Buddha taught about non-attachment, he was offering a concrete method for reducing suffering caused by wanting things to be different than they are. The same mental trap that creates anxiety about your bank account, frustration with your relationships, or disappointment about your career progress. The challenge is that most philosophical texts were written for people living completely different lives than yours. They assumed you had access to philosophical communities, extended periods for contemplation, and social structures that supported deep thinking about life's meaning. They didn't account for 40-hour work weeks, social media, urban stress, or the particular mental health challenges of modern life. This sixth and final technique will show you how to extract the essential psychological insights from ancient wisdom and translate them into practices that actually work within your current constraints. You're going to become a bridge between timeless human wisdom and contemporary scientific understanding, creating personalized approaches that achieve the same mental states the ancient masters were cultivating. Here's why this translation process is so crucial. Contemporary psychology and neuroscience have validated many ancient insights while providing much clearer explanations of how these practices actually work in your brain. When you understand the psychological mechanisms behind philosophical techniques, you can adapt them to be more effective within modern life, rather than trying to recreate ancient lifestyles that are completely impractical today. Let me show you how this works with a specific example. The Stoic practice of negative visualization. Imagining losing things you value in order to cultivate gratitude and reduce attachment sounds abstract and potentially depressing to modern ears. But when you understand that this technique is actually a form of what psychologists call emotional inoculation, it becomes much more practical and appealing. Emotional inoculation is the process of gradually exposing yourself to mild versions of stressful experiences so that you build resilience for handling more significant challenges. It's the same principle used in vaccines. A small exposure to something harmful builds immunity to larger exposures. When you occasionally imagine your car breaking down, your relationship ending, or losing your job, you're not being pessimistic. You're training your mind to stay stable during actual setbacks. But here's where the ancient modern translation becomes powerful. You don't need to spend hours contemplating death and loss like ancient Stoics recommended. You can achieve the same psychological benefits through much smaller, more manageable practices. Maybe you spend 2 minutes each morning imagining one small inconvenience that might happen that day, and mentally rehearsing how you'd respond with acceptance instead of frustration. Maybe you occasionally eat a simple meal while consciously appreciating the complexity and abundance you usually take for granted. The translation method also helps you identify which aspects of ancient practices are essential and which are cultural artifacts that can be modified or discarded. Buddhist meditation, for example, was originally taught in agricultural societies where people's lives followed natural rhythms and seasonal cycles. The traditional recommendation to meditate for hours at a time made sense for monks with no other responsibilities, but it's completely impractical for most modern people. However, the essential psychological benefits of meditation, increased awareness, emotional regulation, and reduced reactivity, can be achieved through much shorter, more flexible practices that fit into contemporary schedules. 5 minutes of focused breathing before starting work can provide similar neural benefits to longer meditation sessions. The key insight is that you're training specific mental muscles, and those muscles can be strengthened through various forms of practice. I worked with Jennifer, a marketing executive who was drawn to Zen philosophy but frustrated by traditional meditation instructions that assumed she had access to quiet spaces and uninterrupted time. We translated the core Zen practice of present moment awareness into what she called micro-mindfulness, tiny moments of conscious attention distributed throughout her busy day. Instead of trying to meditate for 30 minutes each morning, Jennifer practiced present moment awareness while drinking her coffee, paying complete attention to the taste, temperature, and sensation rather than immediately checking her phone. She practiced mindful listening during meetings, focusing entirely on what others were saying instead of planning her next comment. She practiced conscious breathing while waiting for elevators or walking between appointments. These micro-practices achieved the same psychological goals as traditional Zen meditation: increased awareness, reduced anxiety, improved emotional regulation, but they were perfectly adapted to her actual lifestyle. She didn't need to become a different person or dramatically restructure her life to access ancient wisdom. The ancient modern translation method also helps you understand why certain philosophical practices might not work well for your particular personality or circumstances. Stoic emotional detachment might be extremely helpful for someone dealing with chronic worry, but potentially harmful for someone struggling with depression who needs to feel their emotions more fully, not less. Buddhist non-attachment might be perfect for reducing anxiety about outcomes, but counterproductive for someone who needs to develop stronger personal boundaries in relationships. When you understand the psychological mechanisms behind philosophical practices, you can choose the ones that address your specific challenges and modify them to fit your individual needs. You become the architect of your own wisdom practice, rather than trying to force yourself into ancient molds that might not fit your modern life. This translation process also reveals fascinating connections between different wisdom traditions that weren't obvious when you were studying them separately. Stoic emotional regulation, Buddhist mindfulness, and existentialist authenticity all involve developing the capacity to pause between stimulus and response, to create space between what happens to you and how you choose to react. That pause can be cultivated through Stoic reflection, Buddhist meditation, or existentialist self-examination, but the fundamental skill is the same. Understanding these connections allows you to combine techniques from different traditions in ways that the original teachers never imagined. You might use Stoic logic to analyze a challenging situation, Buddhist compassion to respond with kindness, and existentialist authenticity to ensure your response reflects your genuine values rather than social expectations. The ancient modern translation method transforms philosophy from historical study into practical psychology. You're not trying to become an ancient Greek or medieval monk. You're using their insights to become a wiser, more resilient version of yourself within the context of your actual life. You now have 6 concrete techniques that will transform philosophy from interesting ideas into practical life skills. But here's what determines whether these methods will actually change your life or just become more information you never implement. Your willingness to start small and start today. The testing ground method doesn't require you to create dramatic challenges. Practice patience the next time you're put on hold. The reverse engineering approach doesn't demand extensive research. Spend 15 minutes learning about one philosopher's actual life circumstances. The accountability partner system doesn't need formal arrangements. Ask one trusted person to gently point out when your actions contradict your stated values. Most people treat philosophy like entertainment, something inspiring to consume when they have time and energy. But the masters who created these teachings were using them as survival tools for navigating real human challenges. When you approach philosophy the same way they did, as practical psychology for living well, you discover that ancient wisdom isn't ancient at all. It's immediately relevant guidance for handling everything from difficult conversations to career setbacks to relationship conflicts. The transformation happens not through massive effort or dramatic life changes, but through consistent application of wisdom to ordinary moments. Every time you choose patience over reactivity, understanding over judgment, or authenticity over people-pleasing, you're literally rewiring your brain to default to wisdom instead of automatic emotional reactions. Start with one technique that resonates most strongly with you. Give it 2 weeks of consistent practice. Notice how it changes not just your behavior, but your relationship with challenges themselves. Then, gradually incorporate the other methods as they become relevant to your growth. Philosophy isn't meant to be studied, it's meant to be lived, and living it begins with your very next decision.